Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Mark Lynn from School to School International, and today the webcast that we are starting with you all is called "How Good is Good Enough? Doing M&E Monitoring and Evaluation in Conflict and Crisis Zones." We have a terrific panel of guests today working to share some of their experiences with you in the field. Jordine Hale from Chemonics, Casey McHugh from School to School International, Karen Teachin from Creative Associates, Sarah Jones from the Evidence Team at USAID, and myself, Mark Lynn, President of School to School International. I'm going to be calling in. I've had some conflicts with trying to sign on to WebEx this morning, so you'll hear my voice, but you won't see my my computer or my camera feed. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to to the next slide. I don't have access to the slide advanced function, so if the slide for which design for which purpose can be shown. We wanted to start our discussion by sharing with you some ideas about a continuum of the kinds of work that we do. When we go into the field and are asked to do some monitoring and evaluation work, some research, often we're asked by our partners or our clients to try to capture as best as we can what's going on, of course. Often we think of our work on a continuum. Usually the most rigorous type of research we can do at one end of the continuum is called experimental designs. It's considered the gold standard. If we can randomly assign groups to treatment and experimental, these are or treatment and control. These are considered really the best ways to get valid or solid information. However, often when we get to the field, we find that we really are not able to meet some of the conditions that experimental designs like randomized controlled trials are asking us to achieve. So we sometimes use quasi-experimental designs with matched pairs. Sometimes we'll use case studies, more qualitative designs. And of course, even in quarterly reports or these kinds of things, we'll often use things like stories, photos, narratives, that kind of stuff. When we get to the field and we're asked to report using really solid results, how are we able to do that? What kind of research design is the best for us to do? Well, in the theory, we do try to start the more experimental, quasi-experimental end of the continuum. But as time goes on, we realize that conditions prevail such that it might not be possible to achieve experimental conditions or quasi-experimental. So today we're going to be talking about what some of those conditions are, what kinds of situations people find themselves in, and what kinds of decisions those situations make us think about as we are moving through these designs. So I'm going to turn this over to Karen Teachin from Creative Associates, and she's going to walk us through some of the typical things that we researchers find when we get to the field, when we look at the situation in terms of sampling, data collection, interview and instrumentation, and analysis. Karen?
So what we have done is divide the problem areas into the four areas that you see on the slide. And we're going to look through, this is going to be my problem and how I solved it session. But I want to give us a little context first. What do we mean by business as usual? Well, many of us are engaged in the same type of M&E inquiry, which is essentially a large survey that can go from 500 to 300, and as I heard before, 1,200 schools, in which we collect data at the school community level from multiple respondents that range from students to teachers to school directors to community members and to parents. And so what we have done is we've put together a table that we'll be running through that shows the problems that we've experienced and discusses the solutions. We'll quickly run through those, and then we'll hear a real life, my problem and how I solved it from Casey, Jordine, and myself. So with that, why don't we just proceed to sampling? So sampling is critical, and one of the biggest problems are threats to external validity, particularly in conflict areas. Oftentimes it's difficult to develop a sample because you have a missing or suspect sampling frame. Random selection and assignment is not feasible because of the missing sampling frame or other conditions. And my favorite is sample shape shifting, which means the sample that you began with at the beginning of your program at baseline resembles nothing at end line because you've had to make so many compromises. And then we all deal with large samples, and the larger the sample, the higher the risk in conflict areas, as you have to consider the safety and accessibility of your team and the schools and communities where you want to make your inquiry. So I won't go through the solutions, but what I'd like to do is call on one of my colleagues, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, so I'm going to ask either Casey or Jordine to tell us about their problem and what they did to deal with it.
Thank you, Karen. It's Jordine. And addressing some of the issues, the sampling, when you first need to filter out for the threats, the famines, the other conflict zones that may or may not influence your data collection. Once you've done that, it's not so easy sometimes. Once I was involved with a group that was conducting an EGRA, and I wasn't actually part of the team, but they called on me because I was in a place where I had a lot of local knowledge of which schools were actually open and which schools were closed, and which schools were in the middle of demonstrations. Unfortunately, the data collectors ran right into a conflict area because they were relying on the Ministry of Education to tell them which was which. And the Ministry of Education in that place was denying that there was any conflict at all. So it really requires a deep level local knowledge to get to what's going on. In other places, I've used an advanced team that'll go to all of the sample schools and the alternative schools to ensure that the sample size that we need is there and that the schools are in fact up and running and that they're not affected by famine or conflict. A third problem I've had is when you send out a group of data collectors and you allow them to choose the alternative school. Say they go to a school and the school's closed for whatever reason. Then they say, well, let's pick an alternative school. And they go usually to the closest urban school. So one of the solutions that I've implemented for those cases is that there's only one person who's in the central home office who has the alternative list. And when the data collectors run into a school that has some trouble for whatever reason, they need to call back to the central person to get the name of the school that they're going to. That way you're not surprised at the end of data collection that you've got all urban schools that are close to main roads and that you've got a real sample. So those are three examples of times that I've seen or faced a sampling problem and some of the solutions that have worked for me. And now I turn this back to Karen. It's your turn, Karen.
With data collection. Data collection, as we know, once we let our enumerators loose in the field, can present all sorts of surprises, and some of them maybe we shouldn't include in this conversation, but it might be something to talk about over a drink afterwards. But in in conflict areas, the biggest problem is the inaccessibility of schools, of teachers, and students. There's also the adverse effects of your data collection. It opens up the potential for conflict as different groups express suspicion. They might be negative towards who they think you represent. They might be negative towards the enumerators, and there might be infighting amongst the leaders in the community. There are also negative data collector effects that are caused more often than not by lack of experience, but also we found there's competition between data collection teams, which sometimes reflects in the information that they report, and we'll get fabrications or biases. And then finally, there's data collector security, but I should also add there's the community security. In severe conflict settings, you never know what can happen, and there can be threats both to the data collectors but also to the participating community. So to tell us about her experience with data collection in a conflict situation, I believe it's going to be Casey.
Hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data collector security. When conducting a large-scale EGRA, I think all of us are quite familiar with the reasons why tablets might be a preferred method. Data collection is faster, you get better data entry, you can skip the whole data entry process. However, use of tablets can be seen as a risk, as it's seen as high-tech and might create associations that who are these data collectors coming in, who's supporting them, who's funding them. It's something we want to be really careful about in terms of, is the use of tablets putting our team at a greater risk? In order to address this issue, what we did in our data collection is we trained all enumerators on both tablet use for administration of EGRA as well as paper tools. And at the end of the day, it was up to the teams to determine, based on the security situation in the schools that they were working in, whether it was safe to use the tablets or to use the paper tools. And in order, at the end of the day, we ended up having only about 3% of the schools ended up using the paper tools. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the data is the same across the two different administration types. So we also made sure to compare the results at the end of data collection and make sure there wasn't any significant differences before we were able to combine the data set for final analysis.
Great. Thank you, Casey. I appreciate that. And we will move on to the next slide. I have to perform this function here. Okay. Which is interview and instrumentation. Now, we know that our data is only going to be as good as our instruments and also our techniques. So some of the issues that we have is getting consent from both individuals and from the appropriate members of the community that can open doors to us as data collectors. We have to grapple with ethics in terms of disclosures of abuse that might be revealed in the conversations that we have, particularly with children. Then there's the issue of confidentiality. Oftentimes, we'll find that perhaps our ministry colleagues, out of a sense of trying to make things better, would like to have information about particular individuals as well as particular schools. So we need to be very careful from the very beginning to ensure confidentiality. And then the final challenge that we face is, in a conflict situation, innocent questions can be considered extremely stressful to some of the respondents. And so I would like to share a couple experiences that I've had in dealing with issues of interview and instrumentation. I'll start with confidentiality. In a conflict situation, oftentimes there's a great deal of suspicion, not just with the data collection team, but also within the community, particularly if it's a mixed community that represents different interests. So in one country where I worked, while we had identified our individual respondents and proceeded as we would with data collection as normal, we also made sure that we had focus groups to ensure that everyone had a say, because some of the objections that we heard was, why are you interviewing that teacher and not me? Why are you interviewing that child and not my child? So what we did is it took more time, but it opened up the discussion. We learned some interesting things, but it also made everybody feel part of the process. And no one person became victimized as a key informant. The second issue is dealing with stressful questions. I did work in a conflict situation on a child labor project, and many of the children I was interviewing had either been victimized by the guerrillas in the area, meaning the opposition forces, or had become heads of their households while they were children themselves. And after testing some instrument items, I found that children were opening up, but they were also terribly stressed by it, and they were crying and they couldn't go on, and I initially didn't know how to handle it. So I went back to the drawing board and sought out people in the country, psychologists and others on the project team staff, that could guide me on training my enumerators and myself on how to question these children, how to condole with them if that was necessary, how to interact. So those are my two examples. And so since I think I have control, I will move on to the next slide. And this final slide deals with design and analysis. Now, the big gorilla in the room is that when you're dealing with implementation in a conflict situation, you also have to change your implementation plan, and we at the M&E end are often in a position where we have to scramble to catch up, or our carefully designed plan oftentimes falls apart. But we also do have some other problems. We have control groups, which have great potential for increasing conflict if the control group feels that they're not being treated fairly by not receiving treatment. And secondly, we have, naturally, in the implementation, limited and disrupted exposure to treatment. And, that means that what we're measuring might not have been delivered either faithfully, but in the dosage and for the duration that we had wanted. So I believe Jordine is going to give us a real-life example of this.
When I was involved in an early grade reading assessment, an EGRA, of 7 different mother tongues, we found that one of the mother tongues seemed to have improved a wee bit more than the rest, and it was a little suspicious. We had used government Ministry of Education personnel to conduct the EGRA, and they were very well trained. So we talked to USAID about it, and they were quite happy for us to go and retest some of the children in this particular language group that had scored so well. So we chose the top 5 schools that had the really stellar performance, and we used different data collectors that had also been trained and had worked in that language, but different than had originally tested. And a year later, we went back into the schools and did another sample. And we found out that indeed the sample this time was more in line with the other 6 languages, and that the gains that we had seen were perhaps due to enumerator enthusiasm, let's put it this way. The difficult part, USAID was very supportive, but the difficult part was trying to work with the Ministry of Education and the government to explain why it was necessary to double-check outliers. And I think often when we're analyzing our data, we'll see an outlier, we'll see something that doesn't look quite right, but we're hesitant to say, hey, you know, something funky's going on here and we need to really explore it. There's perception that you do it right and the results must be absolutely perfect. And I think we need to, as M&E folks, we need to admit that sometimes things don't go quite the way we expect them to. And we need to be honest and then re-examine, reanalyze, and ensure that our results are correct and that we can stand by them. So that's just an example from my experience of eating a little humble pie, but making sure the data was good. And that's not easy to do. So I'm to pass this on to Mark. Mark, are you there?
Worries. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I'm calling in, so my apologies if there are any technical difficulties. We wanted to share kind of a summary of some of these things that Casey and Jordine and Karen have been talking about in this slide where we summarize tensions and talk about some alternatives. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Jones from USAID to also get the perspective of a donor in the field and how they deal with these questions. As you've heard from some of these stories, working in these conflict zones in the research area really compose challenges around things like representation. Jordine was talking about assessors just choosing whatever schools were near the road or nearby if the randomly selected school wasn't available, which then, of course, if we don't have a random selection, we can't generalize it to a larger population. So how do we deal with that? This is a research problem we have all the time anyway, but in conflict zones, it's often more difficult because there are places we can't go into, and so this idea of random assignment, random selection becomes even more problematic. And then, of course, weighting and generalizing the data quality that we end up having really are not what we thought we would at the beginning of the day. So how do we deal with that tension? We talked at the beginning of this webcast about the continuum between quantitative methods at one end and qualitative at the other. And as we enter into a situation in these countries, we sometimes find out, even if our clearest ideas about the qualitative models we have in our minds are the way we want to go, we find that conditions on the ground just don't allow it. So is it possible to use more qualitative methods or even mixing qualitative and quantitative to still get a reasonable snapshot of what's going on in these countries? And then finally, the tension between reporting and learning. What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to measure in order to demonstrate that we've had an impact or that we've carried out the contract according to the terms that we've agreed upon? Or are we also trying to learn as we go about whether our interventions work, what seems to be working in this particular context? And again, the question will really determine the type of design that we use. So again, in the end, what are we really trying to find out here? So to look at some of the alternatives to business as usual, as Karen has pointed out in the 4 areas we've talked about, we're just going to throw out a few ideas here, and then again we would like to hear from Sarah Jones from USAID, and then open it up to the participants who are listening to this webcast. We've got some questions already, and please feel free to send more. We intended for this to be more of a conversation than just a bunch of PowerPoint presentations, so hopefully you'll also have your own stories, your own questions, and some of your own suggestions for how to deal with some of these tensions. Some of these alternatives that we've thought about are, for example, what if we just use smaller sample sizes? Karen was talking about 12,000. We ran an EGRA in one country over 33,000. In a country that's very difficult to manage that, is that always necessary? Phased cohort or rolling models where rather than having an RCT in one group as the control that is deprived for the entire treatment, we maybe this year do one group and then the next year we include the control as the treatment, et cetera, so they know that the intervention is coming. We can still get a control that way, but at least people are included. Alternatives to counterfactuals in conflict zones. Do we always need a comparison group? Purposive samples, do we always need to randomly sample, or can we, in some contexts, with good rationale, select schools or individuals or communities that we feel respond to the question we're asking? Focus on functional areas. If parts of the country or a region are not are no-go zones, is it okay just to focus on the places where we can go, or do we have to keep pushing on trying to cover an entire area? To reconsider some of our research questions based on all of these points above. If we're trying to find out what's going on, that is one thing. If we're trying to report to a partner or a funder, that's something completely different. So maybe we can rethink what our research questions are with the funders. Which leads to our last point, the count in the AID world, of course. There is the mandate to demonstrate improved reading for 100 million new readers. And so all of us are trying to provide information for this. Is this still a realistic expectation? Maybe we can think in conflict zones. Maybe there are other ways to approach this question. So with those ideas in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah for a few thoughts on, from a funder's point of view, how to deal with some of these tensions and alternatives. Sarah?
Hi, Mark, and hi, everyone that's joined us today. I really appreciate all your participation and hard work that's gone into this. And, clearly there are a lot of challenges that folks face as they're working in monitoring, evaluation, research in context of conflict and crisis. And I want to first start by applauding, first of all, some of the creative solutions that you've discussed in terms of what to do in the face of conflict and crisis. Some of the things that you're suggesting here, such as, reduced sampling sizes, thinking about perhaps purposive approaches, thinking through if and when we should be focused on generalizability. And what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what our expectations are in terms of the agency and more specifically in the Office of Education. And I know at the end we're gonna provide some resources to everyone, but I really strongly encourage you all to take a look at the evaluation policy, which was updated in October 2016, and so there's some changes there that I think are important. And then we also have toolkits that are available publicly for undertaking evaluations for the agency, and we've subsequently added a collaboration learning adaptation toolkit and a monitoring toolkit as well. And part of the reason I mention these things is because a lot of today's discussion was around impact evaluations and large-scale studies. And one of the things that we as an agency are coming to realize is that that isn't always feasible, and it isn't always what we want to take on. And so as you all know, in the evaluation policy, we sort of have these two primary objectives. The first objective is accountability, and the second objective is learning. And we really value the second just as much as we value the first, right? At some level, we're accountable to the taxpayers of the United States, and so we have to be able to demonstrate the progress that we're making, which is a part of what the count that Mark mentioned goes towards. But this other piece is understanding that it's difficult to do programming in these contexts, especially in the areas of conflict and crisis. And we're in a lot of cases having to learn from what the experiences are in the field and what's working, what isn't working. And our objective really as an office is to help strengthen our programming through the types of evaluations that you folks are talking about. What I want to emphasize, I think, is that for us, what's most crucial is fit for purpose. And I think that will come through as you read the updated evaluation policy. While it does talk about impact evaluations, really what we're trying to do is say, okay, what are the objectives of a particular mission in terms of learning agenda, or for a regional bureau or for the office itself, and then to try to fit the methodology to whatever the objectives are. Right. So it may be the case that in certain cases we need to do an impact evaluation that's large scale, but in others that might not be the case. And I think that one of the things that stands out again for me from today's conversation is that you're putting a lot of thought into the approaches that you're taking and coming up with creative solutions. And I think that that's really admirable and really important. And I think about who's doing, you've talked about who is doing the data collection, and Jardine talked about the issues of, having to revisit one of the schools, and was there a relationship between the data that were collected and the individuals who collected it, and also thinking about the sample sizes that you can feasibly reach in a particular context. And I think what's most important here, because we're having a really frank conversation about this here today, is that you should take on those conversations in your evaluation reports as well. So if you're encountering limitations, that's normal. I think all of us here at the agency understand that is normal. And what's crucial is to be transparent about it, is to say, okay, one of the challenges we encountered was the fact that, we weren't able to reach a sample size that we needed for generalizability. And then to be able to say, and here's what the implications are for that. Given all of that, we still think that this information could be useful, right? Because, from the agency's perspective, again, this isn't just about a single evaluation. It's about a compendium of knowledge. And so the more we have, the better off we are in making decisions in the future. And then I think the last point that I wanted to talk about today, or just mention today, is that, with respect to just the work that we are doing in our office, is to work with the missions. So our particular Office of Education has developed an evidence team, and we now have a group of us that are senior monitoring evaluation specialists who are working with individual missions to help provide them with guidance and technical knowledge to help them understand what they need to be asking for, and in what ways we can allow them to have some freedom to receive suggestions from you all as specialists in your fields to say, okay, we understand that you want to do an impact evaluation. These are some of the limitations that you might come across. Or here are the categories of that we want to target for our purposive sampling strategy. And so that's on our end. One of the things that we're trying to do is to try to help build capacity at the mission level and remain committed to working with you, our specialists, while we're in the field, trying to gather this important information. So again, I just want to reiterate my gratitude to all of you and the hard work that you're putting into this.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And that was very useful to hear from USAID's perspective and your own, how to look at these really complex issues. Just to pick up on your last point, providing more support to local missions to help them understand, what the alternatives are and how different ways of thinking about doing this research. just a story that came out of our experience working in a certain country. We had some of the same experiences Jordine had of assessors choosing their own schools in some instances rather than going to the schools on their randomly sampled list. We had some experiences of discrepancies between the official EMIS data set that we used as a sample frame and what we actually found in the field, sometimes a discrepancy of over 30% between what the ministry said existed and what did exist. And yet at the end of the day, we were asked to generalize our results, weight our results, this kind of thing. And of course, at a certain point, you just can't do that because you don't really know what data set you're even working with, how much credibility to give it, and yet we were told to do it anyway. So in that kind of instance, to me, having help from USAID Washington to work with the missions, work with the implementers, to try to understand what some of the limits are on what we can do statistically in order to say something, but still to say something worthwhile anyway. If you've covered a whole country with a certain kind of study, you've got a lot of data. And even if it doesn't meet certain data requirements, it still is a lot of really useful data that can tell a compelling story. So, again, I know we're in a gray area here, and there's no simple answer to these things. But I do appreciate your sharing with us, thinking on AID's part, and I'm eager to hear also from people in the field your own stories. I think we have to do it in a chat format, unfortunately, rather than call in. So if you can type in some anecdotal things that have happened to you, we would love to hear what kinds of situations you've been faced with and what you've done about it, just as we've been presenting today. We do have a few questions already coming in, so we'll start with those. We have a question from Ahmed. Which is better in this situation, tool, tablet, or chart, or any other? I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe it's a question of how to present the data, whether data should be presented in table format or chart format. I'm not sure, but I'll assume that that's what it means. And we'll start with a very quick response. The work we do in our organization, when the primary objective is learning, we do find that either some kind of chart, like a bar chart or a pie chart, or even a colored table. You probably all have used the Excel function where higher is green and lower is red or whatever. Really helps the average non-research type person more quickly understand what our results are telling us. So we do have a variety of approaches that we take to that, whereas when we're reporting to a partner or a funder or publishing for research, we do tend to put more things in tables just because they can carry more information. Again, I'm not sure if that's what the intent was of your question, but we'd be happy to talk more after this webcast about that if you like. I think the second question from Lam, Karen, you can respond to that.
Okay.
About RECCE or RECCE?
Okay. This is the artifact of working in conflict areas with military people. It means reconnaissance. So basically the idea, and I've used it with success in certain situations, is if your program is in a severe conflict situation, you're likely to have security team, and that team will be able to go out and do some advanced scouting in the area where you're going to be sending your enumerators. Oftentimes they'll have security informants in that area so that they can tell you whether it's safe or not to send a team out there.
Okay. Thank you. I learned something as well. I'd never heard that. We have a question. Thank you, Karen. We have a question from Autumn. In measuring dosage, we have challenges collecting individual level student attendance data and tracking it over time. Do you have any methods that have been successful or know of any innovative approaches in this area? Karen, boy, I know you've got lots of experience from the school dropout prevention pilot program that I worked with you on for many years. Would you like to take a shot at this?
Sure. I guess this is from Autumn, right? I feel your pain. Attendance. I wish I had magic solutions, but, we have really focused on attendance data, and we've tried to make it easier for teachers, but we have done training for teachers. We have provided them with the attendance forms. The one thing, as you really need to take attendance for each individual student rather than just head counts. But I'm thinking about dosage, is you need attendance both on students and on teachers. So some of the things that I've done in order to get an idea of dosage is we've done pre-visits to our schools when appropriate, and we will be taking our snapshot of student attendance both during the pre-visit and then also during the actual data collection visit. And, sometimes your project might have spot checks throughout the year, so you can get somewhat of an idea of what the attendance is for both teachers and students. It's less than ideal. The other thing is that I always make sure that whenever I do a school survey, we also talk to the head teacher and to the community as well to determine when the school was open. Because that oftentimes is not reported. So that gets added into your attendance calculation. And then finally, you need to talk to kind of the education authorities in that area to determine what the demands were on teachers. Sometimes during an election season or during a health campaign, the teachers are pulled out of the classroom. So none of those are ideal, but at least it does help you kind of triangulate. Now, you're probably aware of J. Paul's experiments with cell phones that record teacher attendance. I'm assuming that could be used for student attendance. But those types of things generally are not available to us and would be kind of a whole new project. So I'd love to hear other people's solutions to the attendance issue.
Thanks, Karen. And as a segue with your telephone allusion there, Tim wrote, what problems do you think technologies like satellite imagery and GIS can help overcome? Boy, there's a topic for a semester course or longer, maybe a master's course. But just quickly, in terms of our experience, Casey, do you want to talk about the school mapping we've done, I think sometimes with smartphones and GIS coordinates?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I think we're all sort of familiar with is the idea of an enumerator sitting under a tree just filling out a form. One of the things that I think doing GPS coordinates and GIS mapping is you can help triangulate whether or not a school was actually visited. So during the school verification or pre-visit process, you can take the GPS coordinates of the school location and then during data collection, match it against have the team, when they get to the school and do the data collection, take the GPS coordinates again, and you can cross-reference them to make sure that the school was actually visited and a person was actually there at the school as intended. I think that's a very sort of more straightforward, easier thing to implement. I think there's other, I don't know from my own direct experience, but I think satellite imagery and things have been used in terms of in school construction, I believe, checking to make sure that schools are actually completed. And I think there's a lot of opportunities that we're still sort of figuring out. I'm going to turn it back to the other panelists if they have other ideas of where GIS or other satellite imagery might be helpful.
Hi, Karen or Jordine?
And I'm jumping in to say that simple cell phone technology can be pretty amazing in the ability for a scholarship project or a project in which you're tracking positive deviance, taking photographs, and then matching photographs to all of subsequent data collections. Simple tool, but very effective. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on to what Casey was saying, sometimes when we've gone out to schools to do a school verification exercise after sampling, we've also used the photo function so that we can include the picture of the school in the data set with the ID for the school, et cetera, which does give us down the road an idea of whether the school is under a tree or maybe it's a straw school or a cinder block school. And might also be news to the ministry, which often don't have ministries often don't have the resources to do this kind of work. So that can be very useful as well. Again, a large topic. We'd love to hear more from others. Question from Lam again. Do you have examples of solutions when organizational M&E capacity is limited? Oh boy. Data collection is just one hat that organizational staff wear, and they are stretched pretty thin. So teams on projects that are charged with doing M&E, of course, there's a range of skills they need. To the panelists, any stories about problems that you've all run into or quick ideas about what to do to help build capacity amongst these teams?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Lem mentioned that oftentimes teams were stressed with fulfilling multiple functions. And so in my experience, for the most part, I have limited the data collection. I've excluded everyone except, the M&E team members from the data collection. And of course, in order to get data collectors, you really do need to, find them elsewhere. So, of course, we've probably all subcontracted with local data collection teams or have worked with, say, our counterpart ministries to help us. And, of course, all that requires a lot of training, but in terms of working with ministry staff, should they be available, you're certainly building ministry capacity, which is a positive byproduct. And also in terms of your own staff, say the implementation staff, your teacher training advisor or your reading specialist or whomever, we will try to get them into the act if they're not too busy in terms of field supervision. So they will go through the training with the enumerators, but they will serve as field supervisors so that they actually understand the data quite well. And it helps with both their ownership and then later the interpretation.
Thanks, Karen. And unfortunately, we have a string of questions that follow, and this is getting very interesting. Unfortunately, we're running up on the hour, and so we'll have to transition over to our last couple segments. I will ask the panel, if you'd be so kind, we can circulate these remaining questions and respond to these folks. If we have their email addresses, we'll be happy to send these back or post them on the ECCN website. We'll talk with the ECCN folks to figure out how to do that. So we will respond to these in some way. Just two last quick slides. We wanted people checking into this webcast to have a few tools to walk away from the site. The one slide, useful sites and conflict analysis strategies, are some references that we found useful in preparing for this webcast, as well as things that we panelists and research people often refer to in our work. You'll see in the useful sites the ECCN network, which you tuned into for this webcast. INEE has long been doing very good work in establishing parameters around doing work in emergency situations. And then again, 3 more USAID references on program cycle operational policy, the revised evaluation policy Sarah referenced in her talk, and then also the USAID Learning Lab, which has lots of great tools. Also, as we look at this subject, organizations have developed these strategies for doing conflict analysis, which we find very useful. And so you find some references there. We added other. We'd like you to send in your additions as well, both for useful sites and conflict analysis strategies. If you've got other tools you like to use and you'd like to share with the broader community, please let us know. And then finally, the resources, M&E and CC zones slide. Again, some of the research and documents that we like to go back to as we are looking at a new design, a new situation for M&E in a new country. I'll turn it over now to our friends at ECCN for this last 5-minute segment.
Hello, everyone. This is Daniel Levan. I'm with the ECCN support team. I just wanted to draw your attention, for those of you who took an interest in the issues discussed within this panel, to another stream of ECCN work on the development of indicators that'll be coming out into products very soon. It involves, of course, the related measurement and conceptual issues that go into indicator development. And of particular relevance to today's dialogue, we've been collaborating with FHI 360's Equity Initiative on clarifying issues and approaches to measurement of equity and access, equity of access, as well as equity of retention and completion in EICC projects, precisely in situations where there are limitations and gaps in population data, household survey data, school administrative data that make it very difficult to estimate net attendance and enrollment ratios. And we're preparing guidance that will be applicable to the project cycle, and particularly project conception and project design for making the measurement of access, equity of access, as meaningful and as accurate as possible when you're faced with these kinds of data challenges. So part of this, of course, is developing some model indicators and guidance on customizing indicators for projects. And we also heard a lot today about conflict-sensitive measures for data collection. And another of the domains in which we are developing indicators is focused directly on conflict sensitivity, including institutional capacity of implementing organizations to do the kind of conflict-sensitive measures that were discussed today, commitment to and performance of conflict sensitivity analysis in advance of a project and throughout a project, along with conflict-sensitive teaching methods, content, etc. So indicators for those kinds of areas in a project. The third category is for safe learning environments, and a fourth for the ability of adaptive management within a project itself. And their processes are currently getting underway to bring all these indicators from their original task teams that are developing them out to a wider review with USAID and external experts for eventual release to the community of practice as a whole. And in connection with the resources that Mark has brought to your attention, a reminder that the ECCN website has a resource repository where you can find most or perhaps all of the things that were mentioned there, especially ECCN's own products. And we'd like to reiterate the appeal to all community practice members to contribute other new relevant resources where they might find gaps in the repository that exist so far. So that's the conclusion of what I wanted to add to today's webcast, and I believe it falls to me at this point, unless Jordan, you had anything else you wanted to wrap up, to thank all the presenters for a highly informative and helpful discussion, and all of those who attended for your interest today. And I think we can follow up on the ECCN website for additional answers to the questions. And I believe that the slide presentation will also be available. So thank you very much, and we're signing off.